Listen, I understand that I'm on the road a lot, but it feels as though every single time I'm on the road, one of the more important chapters in JJK just decides to drop. And right now, it's not even my fault. I'm on the road. I'm going to a friend's wedding. I'm in New Hampshire, my home state, in the darkest hotel room in America. But I got some bad coffee and conflicting opinions about chapter 266 of JJK in me, so let's get it rolling. And yes, I am heavily conflicted on this chapter. See, because while technically not a whole lot of things of substance happen in this chapter, a lot of things happen in this chapter that actively ensure that we'll never get exposition on a lot of the most lingering questions we as a community have. See, pretty much as soon as we got to see Yuji's domain, it was broken in some capacity by a domain clash against Sukuna. Sukuna opens this chapter actively saying he shouldn't try to recover his curse techniques, and then 35 seconds later recovers his curse techniques. This chapter ends with Sukuna reopening his domain for, I think, the 7th time in the last 12 chapters. The chapter opens with a deep conversation between Megumi and Yuji, something we didn't think we would see for a long time. Yuji loses a curse technique or a curse tool that we don't even understand yet, and oh yeah, Megumi might be back in the fight. Ties into the fact that the chapter ends with a domain expansion that we've never seen before, and that the sure hit effect of Yuji's domain expansion is still kind of up in the air. And tie a little bow on top of it all in the form of a hollow wicker basket, and you have chapter 266 of JJK. So is this chapter bad? No. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that this chapter was good. However, there's been a concerning habit that's popped up of Gege's in recent chapters, where it's beginning to feel as though plot points and restrictions that he established earlier on in the manga are just kind of being forgotten. And as to whether or not they're being forgotten, postponed, or deliberately moved past, we as the readers with inherent biases towards certain characters can't help but feel like we're rushing to a finale here. But at the same time, the product that we are getting is wildly interesting. And that's the conflict of JJK, and exactly what we're gonna get into today. Because today, we're talking chapter 266 of JJK Explained. But before we get to explaining anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow my brand new channel that I created with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk about anime, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, To Talk is Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in manga and anime this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, I'd love to sit here and say that chapter 266 started right off where chapter 265 left off, but that couldn't be further from the truth. In actuality, chapter 266 starts nothing like chapter 265 left off, as chapter 266 starts with a conversation between Megumi and Yuji, something that we haven't seen since Yuji was able to reach to Megumi's soul inside of Yuta's domain. And thus the effect of Yuji's domain expansion seems to be making itself known, as a combined effort of all of the dismantles that Yuji hit at the barrier between Megumi and Sukuna's soul prior to the opening of his domain expansion, and now the opening of his domain expansion seem to have allowed Yuji to finally reach out to Megumi in a way that matters. However, if you were hoping for a rah-rah you can do it speech from Yuji to Megumi, boy oh boy are you not gonna get that. And honestly, that's something I deeply appreciate from this manga. Obviously, yes, Yuji could go down the path of being the anime savior, kind of like Naruto. That's not who Yuji is. Yuji himself is dealing with an internal conflict currently. See, Yuji seeing all of the death and destruction brought about by cursed spirits on Earth and how jujutsu sorcerers have to be the ones to stand between those cursed spirits and the entirety of humanity, has realized that human existence is kind of wretched, especially for those who have to do the heavy lifting. Therefore, Yuji doesn't exactly champion for anybody to rejoin that fight. See, the chapter opens with Megumi telling Yuji that's enough. At which point we get an editor's note saying that Itadori is all ears inside of his domain, listening to Fushiguro. Megumi then goes on to say that he wanted to create a world where he and his sister wouldn't have to go through any mindless suffering. Or at the very least, I wanted to maintain the fragile life that we had, as much as I possibly could. And it's this point that the consequences of Megumi having to watch his own body kill his sister's body are finally becoming apparent. See, because while we knew that Megumi sunk down into the bath after the death of his sister at the hands of Sukuna, we never really heard from Megumi how bad things were in the Megumi camp. Megumi then goes on to say he wanted to cook meals with his sister and watch the sun rays cast down on their drying laundry that was hanging up outside. Megumi even goes on to say that he wanted to see his sister stand stand side by side with people like Yuji. That is to say that Megumi is basically saying, you could have dated my sister if she hadn't become a bug lady and died. Megumi goes on to say that that would have been true happiness for me, but I've had enough. Megumi's essentially telling Yuji that he wanted this life, but he'll never have it now, and therefore he sees no purpose in living. And this is where Yuji begins his conversation with Megumi, in a way that I really respect from Gege. See, Itadori doesn't try to trivialize or minimize what Fushiguro has been through, and he doesn't try to relate to Megumi in a way that squashes everything that's gone on over the last couple of weeks. Instead, Itadori comes to Megumi from a place of understanding. Itadori says, early on, when my grandfather first got lung cancer, he was offered a rough treatment, which we can probably assume was chemo and radiation, that would have given him a chance to fight the lung cancer, but it would have had rough side effects, and thus he turned it down. Itadori then goes on to ponder that maybe his grandfather thought he was strong enough without the medication to beat the lung cancer. However, that wasn't the case, as obviously this manga begins with the death of Yuji's grandfather. Yuji then goes on to say, as he would watch his father struggle with lung cancer, occasionally he would hear about euthanasia, electing to put his grandfather out of his misery. However, Yuji says that that never felt right, like it was somebody else's decision to make, most notably probably his grandfather. Yuji then goes on to say that he would have been able to bear the idea of euthanasia, but it would have been tough for his grandfather. Yuji then continues by saying, ever since I've come to Jujutsu High, I've been inundated with terrible thoughts like this, these moral and ethical quandaries that keep me up at night. And when I think about this going on forever and ever and ever, because I'm now a Jujutsu sorcerer who has an ethical and moral obligation to eradicate these cursed spirits because I'm the only one who can do it, I find myself empathizing with my grandpa, or anybody who's put into a helpless situation. So, and this is the part I really love from Yuji, that's why I can't tell you to keep going. See, Yuji can't necessarily white knight as a Jesus-like character into Megumi's life right now, because he completely understands where Megumi's coming from. He can't sit Megumi down and talk about the beauty of life and how it's worth it to keep on living. Considering what the two of them have been through and what's in store for them in the future, it would be hard for Yuji to genuinely tell Megumi that it's worth it to snap out of this. In fact, it would be unrealistic. It wouldn't be human. And for those of you hoping that Yuji was going to be able to use the power of friendship to snap Megumi out of this, well, unfortunately that's where the conversation ends. See, because as soon as Yuji tells Megumi that he can't tell him to keep going, Sukuna uses hollow wicker basket. And while some readers will simply see this as the beginning of Yuji and Sukuna's battle inside Yuji's domain, I don't necessarily think that's what's going on here. See, in actuality, what I believe is being depicted here is the fact that Yuji's domain allows him to access the soul of who's ever inside of it. See, obviously, domain expansion has to have an innate technique imbued in the barrier, and therefore it was widely assumed that the innate technique imbued in Yuji's domain expansion would be the dismantle, specifically the one that targets the barrier between Megumi and Sukuna's souls. And therefore I believe the reason that this chapter opens with Yuji and Megumi having a conversation is because at the end of chapter 265, Sukuna and Yuji agree to combat. And thus Yuji opens this chapter by applying the innate technique of this domain to Sukuna immediately. And by applying this dismantle to Sukuna, Yuji is immediately able to access Megumi's soul. However, obviously the sure hit guarantee of the dismantle that targets the barrier between Megumi and Sukuna's soul goes away once Sukuna uses hollow wicker basket. And I believe this is corroborated by the fact that when Sukuna uses hollow wicker basket, we see that he's returned back to his original form. He's no longer in Yuji's body. And rather interestingly, when Sukuna uses hollow wicker basket, Yuji also goes back to the form that he had in Shinjuku, the scarred up and broken body. And thus I believe the sure hit effect of Yuji's domain was always in effect from the second that the domain expansion was opened. And the passive effect of that sure hit technique is for Yuji to apply what he believes the soul of everybody in his domain should manifest as. And as Yuji wants Sukuna back inside of his body, or dead, he would obviously apply the image of Sukuna inside of his body, inside of his domain. However, after Sukuna uses his hollow wicker basket is when the battle between him and Yuji truly begins. See, obviously the maintenance of hollow wicker basket isn't that much of an issue for Sukuna. See, because while with most people having to keep two hands interlocked to keep hollow wicker basket at maximum output the entire time to stop the sure hit effect of a domain would be a hassle, Sukuna has 4 arms. However, from the moment that Sukuna launches his hollow wicker basket, he thinks to himself that he would love to use Gojo's ability to fix the parts of his brain that control cursed energy. However, Sukuna thinks to himself that doing this would be too dangerous with the side effects of unlimited void still persisting. And fortunately for him, he never really has to wait too long now, does he? And while Sukuna is thinking all this, Yuji is approaching him, as Yuji does, kind of like Michael Myers, slowly but surely. Sukuna then thinks to himself, however, and it's at this point that the narrator goes on a long exposition about how Hollow Wicker Basket works. That is to say that the narrator says that in contrast to the opening of a domain expansion, using a simple domain or Hollow Wicker Basket doesn't require the actualizing and creating of a mental image, which essentially allows sorcerers who use them inside of domain expansions to buy a little time before the sure hit effect of that domain hits them. However, because Sukuna has forearms and is therefore able to keep his hands together, he's able to keep the Hollow Wicker Basket at maximum output for the entirety of his time inside somebody else's domain. We get it, Gege. He's perfect. Congratulations. You drew him. Which means that Sukuna is able to battle inside other people's domains without getting overpowered. Yay! And boy oh boy, battle does he. The next 2 pages of this manga are just hands no jutsu between Sukuna and Yuji. Sukuna flies in with a kick to Yuji's midsection, which he catches, and then launches a Muay Thai elbow into Sukuna's hip. Sukuna then throws Yuji into the ground and cocks his fist to plant Yuji's face into the back of the earth. Boy oh boy, does he do that as he lands a hard punch to Yuji's face that sends Yuji flying. However, Yuji eventually finds his footing, once again standing across from Sukuna. And it's at this point that Sukuna begins his oh-so-beloved yap fest, where he yells at Yuji saying, who knows, being looked down on would fill me with so much ire, that being pitied would stoke the flames of hatred in my soul so much. And this is an obvious callback to the end of chapter 265, where Sukuna asked, hey, Yuji, why are you walking me through this town? Is it because you pity me? Do you think I deserve love or something? And therefore Sukuna goes on to tell Yuji that it's going to be a real shame what I have to do to the rest of humanity because you looked down on me. Now, it's important to note here, throughout the entirety of this fight, that there is snow falling, and snow on the ground. And if you guys will remember, there were a couple of key things that were brought up in chapter 265, all of which had very real symbolism ties in Japanese, Buddhism, and Shinto lore. A couple of things were pointed out in chapter 265 that were very important. The Onidan statue, flowers, and snow, and Kanon, but we're not going to talk about Kanon right now. But the way in which snow was brought up is that while Yuji was giving his town tour to Sukuna, he wondered to himself if it still snowed in places like Kitakami, because it no longer snowed in Sendai. However, during the course of this battle, we see that snow begins to fall, and over time, snow accumulates on the ground. Now, snow can mean a lot of things in Japan. Like with anything, it kind of depends on where you're looking. See, often in Japanese ancestral art, snow is supposed to depict purity and innocence. In Buddhism, snow is supposed to represent the non-linear path of following the 8 dharmas. However, in Shinto mythology, snow is supposed to symbolize purification, as snow is a foundational piece of the creation myth of Shinto lore that revolves around the sun goddess Amaterasu. And thus, with religious ties running so deep in the recent chapters of JJK, I believe the snow's symbology is supposed to tie back either to Shinto or Buddhist religions. And really, I could see it going either way. However, if I had to lean one way in particular, I would probably go with Buddhism, just because of how many Buddhist tie-ins we've seen in the last couple of chapters. Between Yuji using Jizo's mantra, Mudra, I apologize, or the clear depiction of Kanon in the last chapter, it seems as though Gege is trying his hardest to tie as many Buddhist ideologies into Yuji and Sukuna's battles. And thus, if the presence and falling of snow in Buddhism is supposed to depict the non-linear process of following the 8 dharmas, and for those of you who don't know, the 8 dharmas are kind of like the 10 commandments of Buddhism, then I believe the symbolism of the snow in this chapter ties really well into what's going on with Yuji and Megumi. See, the 8 dharmas are, and I'm going to have to read these because I don't have them memorized, they are that you should have the right view, the right resolve, the right speech, the right conduct, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and meditative absorption, or union. And once you're able to achieve all of the 8 dharmas, you're able to ascend into a higher plane of living. However, ironically, Yuji, who's supposed to be representative of Jizo from Buddhism, a bodhisattva who dedicated themselves to freeing all souls from all circles of living, is currently having a hard time convincing Megumi that there's a reason to go on living. And thus Yuji, who's supposed to be this savior character, is struggling to save the one person he wants to save more than anybody. And thus he's wavering in his own following of the 8 dharmas. That or it could just be snowing, but sometimes it is important to look into the context of what's going on. Now, while Sukuna is yelling about all of the pain he's gonna inflict on humanity that he's absolutely not gonna inflict on humanity, Yuji's gonna win, we're served to a scene we've seen before. And that's Kid Megumi, standing in an alley, looking up at somebody and saying, "What's with that face?" But instead of Gojo staring down at Kid Megumi and seeing a reflection of the man he punched a hole in, instead it's Yuji standing there, with tears in his eyes, as he tells Kid Megumi, "It's just gonna be so lonely without you." Which shows, to me, conclusively, that Megumi is not gonna be saved. Yuji isn't able to find reasons for Megumi to go on living. However, that doesn't mean that Megumi is out of the fight. See, while Yuji can't provide Megumi any real good reasons to go on existing, he can still convince Megumi that battling against Sukuna is the thing to do. And the second that Yuji tells Megumi that it'll be so lonely without him, we see that Sukuna's foot begins to sink in his own shadow, which is eerily reminiscent to what happens to anybody who doesn't cover the bottom of their feet with cursed energy when they step into Megumi's Chimera Shadow Garden. And it's at this point that Sukuna reveals to us that his 10 Shadows technique stopped working after Maharaga was destroyed, and therefore he comes to the realization that this is Megumi. Sukuna begins to panic as he thinks Megumi's soul has already fallen into the bath, yet somehow Yuji Dismantle has breathed life back into the brat's soul, and Yuji, who never lets an opportunity to fade Sukuna slip through his fingers, immediately begins to close the distance between him and Sukuna with a smile on his face. He then lands a flurry of punches in Sukuna's face and then kicks snow into his face after that. The two of them then decide it's time to have a hockey fight, as both of them grab each other by the side of their heads and start throwing a flurry of right hooks. However, this is a much worse idea for Sukuna than it is for Yuji because they're inside Yuji's domain. Thus, eventually, after these right hooks land time and time again against Sukuna's face, he hears a crack and realizes his hollow wicker basket is breaking. See, this is because Yuji's domain appears to work in the way I hypothesized it would. See, Yuji, who doesn't necessarily have any long-range techniques, can't have something like the Horizon of Captivating Skanda's sure-hit technique. Instead, the sure-hit technique of Yuji's domain is applied to his punches, most likely in the form of his dismantle. And this is why when Sukuna is hit with a flurry of these punches, he thinks his strikes have an inescapable technique, which makes Sukuna come to the realization that Yuji is going to break his domain. However, as soon as Sukuna is backed into a corner, don't worry, Gege is there. Because the second that Sukuna begins to fear that his hollow wicker basket's gonna break, his cursed techniques come back. Why? Who could say? Now, of course, the chapter begins with Megumi and Yuji having a conversation, which clearly shows us that the barrier between Megumi and Sukuna's souls is probably the weakest it's ever been. And Yuji's, whose punches are supposed to rewind Sukuna's control over his own body, have just landed in a flurry to Sukuna's face so hard that he was genuinely afraid that Hollow Wicker Basket was gonna break. And sure, Sukuna hasn't hit a Black Flash since the Black Flash that recovered his reverse curse technique. And since then, all that's happened to him is that he's been punched by the person who's supposed to be his kryptonite. But sure, 35 seconds after we identify that he was thinking about using reverse curse technique on his own brain to heal his burnt out curse techniques, let's give it back to him anyways, because consequences be damned when it comes to Sukuna. However, the recovery of Sukuna's curse technique come in the form of him possibly using Dismantle on Yuji's arm. And this brings me, unfortunately, to one of my quandaries with this chapter. See, when Yuji first entered the fray in the battle against Sukuna, we saw that he was wearing what we assumed to be some blood manipulation gauntlets. These gauntlets probably operated in the same way that Chozo was able to harden his abdomen so Yuji's punches wouldn't hurt him. However, we were never given any exposition on them whatsoever. And now they've been destroyed. So will we ever get exposition on them in the first place? No, probably not. Which, just isn't great, especially when you consider the fact that we've now spent 2.5 chapters in Yuji's domain with no explanation of how it works. But losing his blood gauntlet doesn't stop Yuji from the continuous swinging he's throwing at Sukuna's face. Which, mind you, Sukuna dodges. And as Sukuna dodges these punches from Yuji, Yuji thinks to himself, that's Gojo Sensei's ... And then we see Sukuna's opening his domain, and he's using Gojo's hand sign, which doesn't really make sense anymore. Like, yeah, I get it, he figured out how to open domains using Gojo's hand sign because he didn't have enough hands to do it before, but he now has all 4 hands again. So why are we still using Gojo's hand sign? And Sukuna going to open his domain makes Yuji realize that he's been able to reset his burnt out curse techniques. However, as Sukuna's opening his domain, he realizes now that Yuji's blood gauntlet is gone, Yuji's missing 2 fingers, specifically the pinky and ring finger of his left hand. And rather interestingly, the amount of finger that Yuji has lost ties a direct parallel to the image that we saw of Sukuna's 20 fingers being cut off when it was explained how his fingers were turned into cursed objects. Which brings us to the last page of this chapter. See, because the moment that Sukuna goes to open his domain, the location switches to that of a giant spiral staircase. And it appears as though in the middle of that giant spiral staircase is Sukuna's last finger.
But Nick, what do you mean? Didn't Yuta and Rika eat Sukuna's last finger to get the dismantle he used in his domain battle against Sukuna?
Well, maybe not. It was established multiple times over, especially when they were talking about body swapping, that because Sukuna spent so much time in Yuji's body that their souls resonated, which is why Yuji is still able to use dismantle. And therefore, the loss of Yuji's blood gauntlet, displaying the fact that he's lost 2 fingers, what Gege seems to be telling us is that Yuta didn't eat Sukuna's last finger. No. He ate 2 of Yuji's. Now the question here becomes, why 2? And well, the answer to that question could be rather simple. That is to say that Rika has to eat a certain amount of somebody's flesh in order to get their cursed technique. And just eating 1 of Yuji's fingers wouldn't have been enough because obviously he's not Sukuna. His soul just resonated with Sukuna. The answer could be slightly more complex. You could go in a million different theoretical directions. You could say that Yuji gave 1 of his fingers to Rika and the other to Yuta. You could say he gave 1 of his fingers to Rika and the other to Nobara. You can go basically anywhere with this information you want to. But the most important takeaway is almost certainly that the final finger hangs in the balance of what appears to be this new area of domain. So what is this area? Well, it's kind of hard to say. See, while a lot of you out there are probably being like, oh, spirals mean so much in Japanese culture. They actually don't. See, spirals in Japanese culture are usually supposed to symbolize cuteness. That's why when an anime character is tired, their eyes turn into spiral, or they put spiral on cute characters' cheeks. However, in the last 20 or so years, though, after Gunji Ito started writing his horror manga, because he wanted to take something that the Japanese community thought is cute and turn it into something that they're terrified of, he decided to make spirals the subject of his horror manga. And thus the meaning surrounding spirals in Japan has changed because Gunji Ito is prolific. And while the meaning of spirals in Gunji Ito's manga is really up to interpretation, they're supposed to, in Uzumaki, bring towards a feeling of dread and possibly symbolize infinity. But it's really hard to say. What is important, though, in the first half of the last page is it appears as though we start way above the finger. That is to say that in this almost infinite spiral staircase, we are massively high above the finger that is displayed in the center of one segment of the staircase, which shows to us that possibly Yuji and Sukuna will have to go down this staircase to get to this final finger, which actually ties very nicely into the Yuji is Jizo symbology. As Jizo, as a Bodhisattva, exists in the highest realm of existence, the realm of Buddhas, but refuses to accept this ascension into the highest realm of living until all of the other realms are eradicated of their souls. That is to say, until all other realms are brought to the same highest level of existence that Jizo should exist in. And thus what is essentially this clash of domains between Yuji and Sukuna is symbolized by Yuji having to go down an infinite staircase to what appears to be a lower level to effectively save Megumi from Sukuna. And therefore I believe that Yuji's domain was always meant to have Sukuna open his domain inside of it. See, because what was opened when Sukuna opened his domain was not Unlimited Void or Malevolent Shrine. It seemed to create this new area, which is a symbolic push and pull battle between Yuji and Sukuna for the last finger. And this most likely happened because Sukuna decided to use Gojo's hand sign. This is why Yuji acknowledged that Sukuna was using Gojo's hand sign. It's supposed to draw our attention to that fact. And when you consider the fact that the person who had the last of Sukuna's fingers to stay off Yuji's execution at the hands of the Jujutsu Society was Gojo, it appears as though Sukuna deciding to use Gojo's hand sign to enter in a domain clash against Yuji revealed the location of the final finger. And this kind of makes sense. See, if you were Gojo, where would you hide the final finger? The finger that would keep Yuji alive? Well, ideally you'd want to keep it somewhere that only you could ever access. And considering the fact that Mahito and Kenjaku were able to break into the most secure vault the Jujutsu Society had and steal not only the Death Womb paintings, but also the most powerful barrier user in the entirety of the world, Tengen, storing it somewhere created by the Jujutsu Society doesn't make all that much sense. And therefore, I would reckon that in actuality, Gojo hid the final finger in Yuji. Kind of. See, there's a solid possibility that Gojo, the person who understood Yuji's capacity to get strong better than anybody, knew at some point he would awaken a domain expansion. And therefore, there's a possibility that somehow Gojo, maybe while Yuji was dead, much akin to how Itachi built in a system of Shisui's Kodo Matsukame to cast Kodo Matsukame on Itachi's eyes the next time it saw them, that Gojo built into Yuji that should Gojo and Yuji ever have a domain clash, that the location of the 20th finger would be revealed. At which point, Gojo and Yuji would be able to fight for said final finger. See, because in the scenario where Gojo and Yuji were in a domain clash, clearly Gojo would be proven wrong. At that point, obviously, if Gojo and Yuji were in a battle to the death, Yuji had switched to the side of the bad guys. And therefore Gojo, as the self-proclaimed strongest, trusted himself in that scenario to be Yuji's own executioner. And thus the reason that we're currently seeing this new battlefield is not because of Yuji or Sukuna, but because of Gojo. But then again, what do I know? And will this ever be explained? Probably not, because we are just blazing through content and not explaining anything, which is very non-Gege. But that doesn't mean that this chapter didn't have a lot of patented Gege-isms, like Sukuna being backed into a corner and immediately remembering, oh, never mind, I'm fine. But there's no break this week, and apparently the battle between Yuji and Sukuna is just now reaching its climax in the next chapter. And JJK is not only going to have a full color spread, but also be featured on the cover of Shonen Jump. So expect a big chapter next week, and also expect me filming from my Cape house. I won't be in a hotel. I'll be in my childhood home. And honestly, if you told me 5 years ago I'd be filming a JJK manga review chapter in my childhood home, I'd say, what's JJK? But that's all I got for this chapter, guys. But I'm curious, what did you think of chapter 266? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Are you wondering where Hikari is? Because boy oh boy, so am I. Are you wondering what's going on with Yuta and his 5 minutes? Because boy oh boy, so am I. We established he had 5 minutes to live. He used 3 of them in his domain, and now he's just kind of laying on the ground. Is Gojo's corpse just re-entering the battlefield? We have lots of questions, and not a lot of them are being answered, but that's fine. Tell me all about your woes and loves in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now I just get to wait until Boruto comes out. This is empty.